Tonight on the Midnight Drive, we're revisiting one of you guys' favorite topics, but we're going to be listening in to something that most people don't talk about. It's not about what you see, it's what you hear. It usually starts quietly, easy to miss if you're not paying attention. A low static, like an old television warming up somewhere in the room. Then it builds, and it doesn't stop building. For some people, that sound is the first sign that something is about to happen. Before the pressure. Before the paralysis. Before anything appears in the dark. It's just noise, getting louder and louder and louder, until it feels like it might swallow the room entirely. And by the time it peaks, it's already too late to move. Now, something that I've noticed about sleep paralysis is that people tend to talk about what they see. They figure at the foot of the bed, the shape in the corner of the room, the weight that you feel on your chest. That's the part that sticks, right? That's the part that gets shared. But there's another part of it that doesn't come up near as often. The sound. We're not talking background noise here, and we're not talking about something subtle. It's something that takes over entirely. For me, it always starts the same way. I can tell that it's coming before anything else happens. There's a moment where the room is still and normal. It's quiet. It's familiar. And then, all of a sudden, something shifts. It's not a voice. Not at first. It's actually closer to static. The closest comparison that I've found is like an old television. The kind with a dial. You turn it on, and there's a faint hiss before anything else. If it's not tuned to a channel. You get that white noise. Soft at first, almost ignorable. Then you reach for the knob and you turn the volume up just a little bit. Except in this case, no one is touching the knob. The volume starts to increase a little bit at first, but then it just keeps going. The volume climbs slowly, steadily. There's no jump. There's no sudden spike. It's just a continuous increase. At a certain point, it becomes impossible to ignore. It fills the space. It stops feeling like it's coming from any direction. It's not from the corner of the room. It's not from the hallway. It's everywhere all at once. And it keeps getting louder. There's a threshold, a point where it crosses from something you're noticing into something that you're trapped inside of. For me, that's when everything else starts. The visuals. The ones you're familiar with. Sometimes it's a shape, sometimes it's something a little more defined. The kind of thing that people describe as either a shadow or a figure or the little monster sitting on your chest. The details change, but for me, the sound doesn't. It's always there, underneath everything. And by the time it reaches that peak, the rest of it is already in full motion. The body locks. That's the part that's easier to explain. During REM sleep, the brain essentially turns off voluntary muscle movement. It's a safety mechanism to protect you from acting out your dreams. Sleep paralysis happens when the system is still active, but your awareness comes back online. You're awake, but your body isn't. That part's documented, and we've talked about it extensively on the show here. That part is studied. It's measured. It's hard to pin down exactly what's going on with what you're hearing and what you're seeing, though. Because in the overlap, the brain is still capable of producing dream content, even though you're conscious. Your brain can still create images, sensations, and sound. When those things bleed into waking awareness, they don't feel like imagination anymore. They feel external. They feel real. The sound, especially, has a way of convincing you that it exists outside of you. It doesn't behave like a thought. It behaves like something that's literally in the room. Something with presence. In a lot of reported cases, people describe hearing movement. Footsteps, breathing, something shifting that's just out of sight. Others describe something closer to what I've experienced. A sustained, building noise. Static or a hum. A kind of pressure that isn't physical, but it feels like it's pressing in anyways. There isn't a single explanation that covers all of it exactly. Some researchers point to the auditory cortex still being active in a dreamlike state. Others suggest it's the brain trying to interpret incomplete sensory information, filling in gaps with patterns that are familiar. White noise is a simple one to fill in those gaps. It's random, but the brain doesn't like randomness. It's looking for structure, for meaning. And sometimes it finds it, and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes, before it has time to decide, the experience moves forward into something else entirely. For me, the sound is like a warning. It tells me exactly what's about to happen. There's no confusion anymore. None at all. No moment of wondering if I'm just imagining it. Once it starts, I know exactly what's going to happen. The rest of it follows a familiar pattern. The pressure, the attempt to move, trying to wiggle the fingers, trying to force any small part of the body to respond at all, trying to speak, realizing that nothing comes out. There's a point where the mind shifts from confusion into something more focused. It's an urgency. For me, that usually turns into prayer, not out of habit, not out of routine, but as a response. Something about the experience pushes things in that direction. The feeling that whatever is happening is not just physical. Even if later I can explain parts of it away. In the moment, it doesn't feel like that at all. It feels immediate. It feels like it's closing in. It feels very real. Then, eventually, something breaks. It's small at first. A finger moves. A hand. The body starts to come back online in pieces. And just as quickly as it built, the sound is gone. Not fading out. Just gone, replaced by something else. Silence. The kind of silence that feels heavier after everything just happened the way that it did. What do you make of this? Do you experience the static? If you've ever gone into sleep paralysis and have it regularly. If you have, let us know in the comments below wherever you're listening. We'd love to hear your thoughts. You're listening to the midnight drive. I think one of the most bizarre parts about the experience is how fast the sound goes away. It doesn't fade out. It's just gone. Silence. The buildup of the static seems like it's lasting for hours. The whole sleep paralysis experience might last 20 seconds to maybe a minute and a half. But time works differently when you're in that sleep state. But the sound just going from unbearable to gone, completely silent. It just feels so heavy after experiencing everything before that. It's crazy. Sometimes there's a faint ringing or something left over. I mean, I have myself to blame for the tinnitus that I have from all the loud music that I've listened to over the years. But it's not quite the same. It's not that kind of ringing. But of course, the room goes back to being a room. There's nothing in the corner. There's nothing sitting on my chest. It's just an after effect in the memory of how loud it was. Wow. It's such a bizarre concept to have memory of sound, especially when it's something that your brain created. But that pattern, it repeats over and over and over again. The visual details change. Different shapes, different interpretations, but the sound stays consistent. Which raises a question. If the visuals can change and the interpretation can change, why does the sound stay the same? Why does it always start there? And why does it feel like something that you can actually hear instead of something that you're thinking about? There is a point where the sound shifts. Not always, and not for everybody, but for some people, it stops being noise. All right? It starts to feel intentional. Up to that point, it's easy to describe what's happening in simple terms. It's static. It's like an electrical hum. Something building in the background. But when that shifts into something that sounds like a voice, the experience changes completely. Because now there's structure, now there's direction, and sometimes there's even a response. I've had moments where it felt like something was speaking directly into my ear. Not across the room, not from the corner. Something close. Close enough that it doesn't feel like it's traveling through space at all. It feels placed. It feels like it's literally laying on the same pillow as I am. I vividly remember asking the void when I was in the middle of sleep paralysis. I remember asking, "Why in the world do you keep doing this to me?" And as all of the static stopped, it just went gone. And usually that indicates that the experience is over. But for a split second after all of the static was gone, I just heard a very low and very loud voice right there in my left ear. It was my left ear. I recall it very clearly. It just said, "Because I can." That was it. That was it. And oh man, that one stuck with me because it felt so close, and so clear. The voice was so clear. It's a very low voice. It's bizarre. It's weird even thinking about it. I don't talk about it very much, but here we are. I'm talking with you. So the first time that it happened, I didn't question it. That's the part that stands out the most when I think back on it. There was no moment where I stopped and I thought, this doesn't make sense. It felt immediate. It scared the heck out of me. Natural in a way that's very hard to explain now because the voice was so freaking clear. It wasn't distorted. It wasn't distant. It was clear enough to understand without any effort. And it was as loud as I'm talking to you right now. So going from increasing static sound to nothing to having a voice articulating clearly with enunciation and volume. What do you do with that? It felt so direct. It was like I was having a literal conversation. Except I couldn't speak, and I was articulating something with the full force of my brain into the void. Why does this keep happening to me? And then a very clear, articulate response. Because I can. That's it. Who is I? I don't know. It's a very strange instinct that kicks in when that happens. You don't just listen, you respond, even if your body can't move, even if you can't speak out loud. There's still that impulse to engage with whatever this thing is, to ask a question, to see if it answers back. And sometimes it does. Golly, that's where things start to feel less like a passive experience and more like a full-on interaction. Again, I asked it a question from my mind. It was a focused question. It was intentional. Just like if you were standing next to me asking you a question, just straight up next to me. And you give me a clear response. And in that moment, I absolutely accepted it without any hesitation. There wasn't any time to analyze it. There was no distance from it. It was just the immediate sense that something had literally spoken and I had understood it so clearly. Looking back, that's the part that's hardest for me to sit with. Not what was said, but how convincing that it felt. How quickly the mind accepts something like that when you're in that state. There's a tendency to assign identity to it almost instantly, to decide what it is, to name it. Again, who is I? Because I can? We've talked about this before because this gets into some of the dangers of interpreting sleep paralysis. Because sometimes that comes from personal beliefs. Sometimes it comes from fear. Sometimes from whatever feels like fits in the moment. For me, there was a point where I was convinced that I was speaking to something very specific, something with intention, something that was answering me. And in the moment, there was no separation between the experience and the conclusion. They felt like the same thing. This wasn't the same incident that I was just telling you about. This was something that happened way before that, and it felt way more abstract because it felt like everything was kind of happening in my mind. But outside of that state, it becomes harder to hold on to the certainty of exactly what was happening because there's other ways to look at it. Sleep paralysis sits right at the edge of dreaming and waking. The body is still in one state. The mind is moving into another. And during that overlap, the brain is still capable of producing dream content. Not just images, language, dialogue, structure. We already know that internal thoughts can take on different forms. People rehearse conversations in their heads all the time. They imagine responses. They hear voices internally. Have you ever heard a voice internally from your sleep paralysis experience? Tell us about it. Tell us about it in the comments below, wherever you might be listening. If you'd like, go ahead and drop us a line on our hotline, the Midnight Drive, 402-610-2836. If you leave us a message, we'll gladly play it on the air. We'd love to hear from you here on the Midnight Drive. With sleep paralysis, there's usually a very clear boundary. You know that it's you. But in the state, that boundary isn't always as stable or as clear. The same system that produces internal dialogue might still be active. But the sense of ownership is reduced. It doesn't feel like you. It feels external, like somebody else. It's something that's placed into the space around you that could explain the clarity, the responsiveness, even the timing. But it doesn't fully explain the experience, because in the moment, it doesn't feel like a misfiring system. It feels like a full-on presence. And presence changes how we react. It narrows our focus. It sharpens our attention. It creates urgency. If something is speaking to you, you listen. If it responds, you engage. Even if part of you is aware that something isn't quite right here, there's also something else happening. Sound is one of the fastest ways that we as humans detect threats. Faster than sight in many cases. A noise behind you triggers a response before you even process what it is. A voice, especially, demands attention. It's one of the most important signals that we recognize. So, when the brain produces something that sounds like a voice in that state, we are not experiencing it neutrally. It carries weight and urgency immediately. It feels important. It feels like something that you need to pay attention to. That doesn't mean it's coming from the outside, but it explains why we feel like it might be. There are also patterns in how people describe these voices. Some report hearing their name. Some describe short phrases, fragments, commands. Others describe something more conversational, back and forth, questions and answers. The details vary, but the structure shows up often enough to notice. That doesn't make it a single phenomenon with a single cause. It just means the experience tends to organize itself in similar ways. And that's where interpretation starts to take over, because once something sounds like it's speaking, the mind wants to know who it's talking to. Not what, who. It looks for identity. It reaches for something familiar, or something that fits the emotional tone of that moment. If the experience feels threatening, the identity often follows that direction. If it feels neutral, the interpretation shifts. That doesn't mean the identity is coming from outside, but it does show how quickly the brain fills in the gap and how convincing that process can be. Especially when you can't move. Especially when the sound is close enough to feel like it's right next to you, or inside the space where your thoughts usually are. And then, like everything else in this state, it ends. Not gradually, not with any kind of clear conclusion. It just stops. The voice, gone. The room comes back. Your body starts to respond again. And you're left with the memory of something that felt real enough to question long after it's over. Not just what you heard, but how it behaved, how it answered, how it felt like it was there, how it felt so sentient. And that leaves different kinds of questions. Not just why the brain produces sound in that state, but why it sometimes produces something that feels like it's listening back. There's a point where the sound stops feeling like part of the room, and it starts feeling like an actual event. Something sudden, something sharp, something that doesn't build slowly the way that static does. It just happens all at once. Some people describe it as a loud bang, like something heavy hitting the floor, a door slamming, a gunshot in the next room. Others describe something more mechanical, a metallic snap, a crash, something breaking, and for some, it's a voice. Not a conversation this time, not something that unfolds, just a single loud sound, an articulation, close enough to feel immediate, clear enough to feel real, and then nothing. It's over just as quickly as it started. There's no buildup, there's no gradual fade. It's just a sudden intrusion into an otherwise quiet moment. This is often described as a separate experience, something that happens on its own, usually as someone is falling asleep or just waking up. There's a name for it: exploding head syndrome. Despite the name, there is no pain, no physical damage, just the sound and the confusion that follows it. It's recognized as a sleep-related phenomenon. Documented, studied, but it's not fully understood. Some theories suggest it's a kind of misfire during the transition between wakefulness and sleep. Very similar to how sleep paralysis is triggered. It's a sudden burst of activity in the brain's auditory pathways. Others point to shifts in how the brain regulates sensory input during that transition. The balance it normally filters and organizes sound might briefly lose its balance, and instead of a gradual change, you get a spike. A single event, loud enough to pull you fully awake. What's interesting is how closely it sits next to sleep paralysis for some people. Not always at the same time, but in the same range of experiences, the same boundary, the same moment where the brain is moving between states. For some, the loud sound is the beginning, a shock that pulls them into awareness but leaves the body unresponsive. For others, it shows up in the middle, interrupting the experience, breaking the pattern for a moment before everything settles again. And for some, it never connects at all, just a separate event entirely. Something that happens occasionally, unpredictable, but familiar enough that it becomes part of the same category. A strange thing that happens at the edge of sleep. The reason it matters here isn't just the sound itself, it's because it tells us about how the brain handles transitions. Because this isn't a slow drift. It's not a dream forming over time. It's immediate. A full sensory event without any warning. Which raises a different type of question. If the brain can produce something that loud, that sudden, that convincing, without any external source, what else is it capable of doing in that state? We tend to trust sound. If something crashes in the next room, we don't assume that it came from inside of our own head. We react, we orient, we look for the source. That instinct doesn't turn off just because we're halfway asleep. If anything, it becomes more sensitive, less filtered, more reactive. So what happens like this when the response is immediate? A spike of awareness, a moment of confusion. Trying to reconcile what you just heard with the fact that nothing in the room has changed. That gap doesn't always close very cleanly. For some people, it leaves kind of a residue, a lingering sense that something happened, even if there's no evidence of it. And that's where it overlaps with the rest of these experiences. Have you ever experienced exploding head syndrome? I only have once or twice, and it definitely shocks your system, that is for sure. I'd love to hear about your experience. Please let us know in the comments below. We're going to continue talking about the auditory craziness that resides inside of our dreams. Just the way that we experience it during sleep. You're listening to The Midnight Drive. Because sleep paralysis, auditory hallucinations, and these sudden sound events all live in the same territory, not fully asleep, not fully awake, in between. That space is not stable. The rules shift. Things that normally stay separate start to overlap. Dream content, waking awareness, internal thought, external perception. They don't always line up the way that we expect. And when they don't, the brain still tries to make some kind of sense of it. It looks for patterns, for cause and effect, for something to hold on to. Sometimes it finds it. Sometimes it builds it. That doesn't mean that the experience isn't real. The sound is real in the sense that it's perceived, it's processed, it triggers a response, but the source is much harder to locate. And that's when things get complicated, because once you've had an experience like that, it changes how you approach the next one. You start to anticipate it, not necessarily consciously, but somewhere in the background. The awareness is there that this can happen, that something can break the silence without warning, that your own perception isn't always a reliable guide in that moment. That awareness can do two things. It can make the experience less surprising, or it can make it more intense, because now you're not just reacting to what's happening, you're reacting to a memory of it happening before. That layering starts to build over time, one experience informing the next. Sound becomes more than just a trigger. It becomes a signal, a marker that something is shifting, even if you don't know exactly what comes next. And sometimes the sound doesn't come at all. Sometimes it's completely quiet. No buildup, no voice, no sudden noise, just stillness and the awareness that something is off, which might be the most unsettling version of all, because without the sound, there's no warning, no signal to prepare you, just the moment itself, fully formed, already happening. By the time you recognize it, you're already inside of it, which leaves us with a different kind of edge to sit on. Not just the presence of sound, but its absence. And what it means when there's nothing there to hear, but the experience still finds you anyways. The first time experiencing this, it's so confusing. The second time, there's recognition. And after that, it becomes something else. It's not predictable, but it's familiar. You start to notice the pattern, how it begins. For some people, it's the sound, that slow rise, the static, the hum, a signal that something is shifting. For others, it's more subtle, a feeling, a change in the weight of the room. A sense that sleep isn't unfolding the way that it normally does. But once you've felt it, you don't forget it, and that recognition changes the experience. You're not just reacting anymore. Part of you is watching it happen. Even if you can't stop it, even if you can't move, there's a layer of awareness that sits just behind everything else, tracking it, waiting for the next step. That awareness can be very useful. It can shorten the experience. It can make the experience less scary. Some people learn how to focus on small movements, a finger, a toe, something minimal, enough to break the paralysis. Others learn to stay still, to ride it out. That's what I choose to do. Whenever I experience sleep paralysis, I like to see where it takes me. And just let it pass without fighting it. But that's not always how it goes. Sometimes recognition makes it harder, because now you know what's coming. The sound starts, and your mind moves ahead of it, anticipating the peak, the moment where everything locks in. That anticipation builds its own kind of pressure, separate from the experience itself. It's layered on top of it. And in that space, the mind starts to reach for meaning. Not in a deliberate way, in a reflex. If something feels like it's there, you want to know what it is. If something sounds like it's speaking to you, you want to know who it is. That instinct doesn't disappear just because you understand the mechanics of your sleep paralysis episode. You can know about REM atonia. You can understand how dream content bleeds into waking awareness. You can recognize the pattern as it's unfolding and still feel like you're not alone in the room. That's the part that lingers, not the explanation, the feeling. Because the explanation works best after the fact, when you're sitting up, when the room is quiet again, when your body responds the way that it's supposed to. In the moment, it's different. The brain prioritizes what feels immediate, what feels present. Sound plays a huge role in that. It always has. It's what we've been talking about. We rely on it to orient ourselves, to detect movement, to recognize voices, to understand intention. So when something in that state behaves like a voice or a presence, or even just a sound that doesn't belong, it carries a special kind of weight. It demands attention. It reshapes the experience. Even if it doesn't have a clear source, even if it disappears as soon as control comes back to us. That's where the uncertainty settles in. Not in the event itself, but in what it means. Is it just the brain moving between states, producing something convincing enough to feel external? Is it a kind of overlap where systems that normally stay separate are active at the same time? Or is it something about perception in and of itself? The way the mind fills space when it doesn't have enough information. The way it assigns presence when we're vulnerable. There isn't a clear answer. There probably isn't a single one, even. What we have here are patterns, shared experiences, similar descriptions from people who have never compared notes. That doesn't make it one thing, but it makes it worth paying attention to because it shows us something about how the mind behaves under specific conditions, how it builds reality in real time, how quickly it can shift from internal to external, from thought to sound, from silence to something that feels like it's right next to you, and then back again. Gone, without a trace, except for the memory. And maybe that's the part that stays with people the longest. Not what they saw, not even necessarily what they heard, but how real that it felt. How immediate, how close. Close enough that for a moment, there was zero distance between the experience and the conclusion. No gap to question it. For a moment, you were in the void. No gap to question it. Just the sense that something was there. And then it wasn't. Which leaves you in a quiet room trying to decide what to do with that. Whether to file it away as something your brain produced, or if it's something you experienced. Those aren't always the same thing, you know. At least they don't feel the same. And maybe that's where this settles.